As time went on, starting around the beginning of the 20th century, American politics saw a big shift in focus and actions. The Civil War was now 35 or 40 years past, but there was a different divide. Call it the haves versus the have-nots. Call it labor versus management. Call it the establishment versus the anti-establishment. On the ground, it was the progressive movement and the populist movement, each in its own way, versus, to use an old phrase, the powers that be. And to put this period correctly in perspective, we must pause here to explain a big change in who was who, what was what, and what they called themselves. Now, back in Abe Lincoln's time, the Republican Party was the Liberal Party, anti-slavery, pro-human rights. The Democrats, at least the Southern Democrats, was the conservative, the pro-slavery party. By 1900, this has turned almost 180 degrees, other than in the Old South. The Republicans had become the party of big business, the establishment, the old guard. The Democrats, at least the Western Democrats, had more so become advocates for the little guy. Workers, laborers, miners, and their enemy were the big interests, the big mining companies, the big railroads, and big government power, which was exercised by the now old guard Republicans. In one sense, it was a major historical turning point in American politics, a realignment that, to some extent, continued through the entire 20th century.
The progressive movement during this period was a movement aimed at making things better. The idea of we as a society are progressing. Darwinian theory was a big thing at that time. Things should be getting better. Children shouldn't have to be losing fingers and arms in factories. Women should be being treated more equally. A lot of things about society should be made better, and the progressives' approach to that was to have a government that was more responsive and provided justice to its citizens.
So by 1910 or so, it was clear that in Arizona, the labor movement was very strong. The question of how the mines should be regulated, the question of whether or not other progressive movements in political structures, such as what was called the Oregon Plan, referring to the initiative and the recall and the referendum. All of these were fairly important items to make part of the discussion about Arizona's constitution and its statehood.
Populists, on the other hand, it was more of a farm-generated movement. And the idea was that big government and big business are bad. And so for the progressives, big government was not a bad thing, but a bad government was a bad thing. And so their approach to dealing with that was to put more power in the hands of the people.
And in some cases, these new political movements, particularly the populists, advocated and exercised violence.
The progressives themselves were probably not, they didn't advocate violence. There's this whole spectrum of political movements, from anarchism, which came from Europe mostly, and communism, socialism. Socialism was an accepted political party at that time. There were socialists, Democrats, and Republicans, and then progressive parties, since there were progressives in all three of those other movements. But the violence came mostly, in the West, came mostly from the labor movement. The labor movement was pretty strongly socialist, with the leaning towards anarchistic in some ways. So the idea was that for decades, big business, railroads, and investors, banks, the people who controlled power had subjugated the workers, and the workers during this era in 1900 to 1910 were asserting themselves. Labor management relations were dictated by dynamite. during that period. So in Idaho, for example, the former governor who had been part of breaking a strike was assassinated by a bomb on New Year's Eve. The New York Times, which was seen as an arm of corporations and railroads, was bombed as part of a labor situation. In both cases, Clarence Darrow was the attorney for the accused. But this was a period of great unrest, and the labor had begun establishing itself as a force, and the people of Arizona were open to someone who could stand up to big corporations and railroads that they thought were taking advantage of them.
Well, down here in the Sonoran Desert and in the mountains and plains of northern Arizona, the highest priority for almost 50 years was statehood.
We first, Arizona, the citizens of Arizona first started requesting statehood in the 1870s, and it continued over the next few years. The subject would come up. At the beginning, it was the Indian Wars, our notorious reputation, and then the outlawry, the Pleasant Valley War, the Cochise County War. It was a remote, very few roads out here, and it was a wild country, and a lot of it was just the perception of Arizona as a really wild place. Then, when they did, as the century was closing, we even were the first to volunteer for the Spanish-American War, and the reason being, we'll show these Americans we're ready for statehood. We'll be we deserve statehood, and but there were others who didn't think so. Senator Bard of California said we had too many Indians and Mormons out here. Senator Albert Beveridge took a quick trip. He was the chairman of the Committee on Territories. He took a fast blink trip out here and decided this place is. I think he thought maybe I'm paraphrasing, but he said all it's got out here is rattlesnakes and scorpions and Mexicans and Mormons and Democrats.
The real question, as we look back on 1910, is why did Congress finally decide to let us start the process for statehood? I mean, after all, the White House, the Congress, the U.S. Senate were controlled by the Republicans. Arizona Territory was mostly with the Democrats. Why would they allow a new Democrat state? Well, to some extent, it had to do with Arizona's lobbying effort. A territory has no U.S. senator, but gets to elect one member of Congress, technically called a delegate. That person can vote in committee meetings, but not on the floor of the House. In our case, over those 49 years, the Arizona delegate's main job was to lobby for statehood. You might think that Democrat Arizona would have always elected a Democrat to that position. Not so. At various times, there were also independents. There was something called the Unionist Party, and there were Republicans. Our final delegate from 1909 to 1912 was named Ralph Cameron, a Republican who was well connected with the Washington leadership. It is said he was particularly close with Senator Albert Beveridge of Indiana, the chairman of the key committee. Maybe Cameron was persuasive. Maybe friendship prevailed. Other suggestions are that Democrat Arizona was balanced by the admission of the more Republican New Mexico, and that Senator Beveridge wanted to have a big say in the requirements outlined in the Arizona Enabling Act. All right, so what is the Enabling Act? Basically, it is an act of Congress that says you can write a proposed state constitution, which we will later approve or disapprove, depending on what you write. The federal government paid for this effort. The Department of Interior put up $100,000 to cover the cost of the election of delegates and to pay salaries of those delegates and their staff. They had 60 days to complete the task. Alice Duckworth of the Arizona State Library often lectures on the subject. We spoke with her in the original historic legislative chamber, the very room in which the Constitutional Convention held its meetings. It's important to realize that in the Enabling Act, Congress built in a set of instructions listing numerous things that the proposed Constitution must include and other things that it must not include.
For one, it had to be Republican or representative in nature. Two, we could not make any laws that discriminated on the race or color, and we could not make laws that discriminated against religion. And so those had to be in. The Indian lands, the reservations, we could not make any laws regarding the reservations. However, we had to have laws that said no selling of liquor to the Indians. We were just coming out of the polygamous plural marriages of the Mormon Church tradition, and so that was also a strict no plural marriages. English would be the official language, and that was in there. The new state would pick up all debts belonging to the territory. We couldn't